Hello and welcome to the webinar. This is the monthly Manufacturing Public Policy Update brought to you by NTMA and PMA. I'm Caitlin Sickles with the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell. You'll also, on the webinar today, hear from Paul Nathanson, also at Bracewell, and from Omar Nashashibi at Inside Beltway. And we are very excited to have Jennifer Baker-Reed with us today. Jennifer is from the Lauren Baker Group, and she will be speaking about tariffs and trade. She's a real expert in that space, so we're very glad to have her on the webinar today. Today's webinar is sponsored by Federated Insurance. We're very grateful to them for their partnership and their support of this program. So thank you to the team at Federated Insurance for sponsoring the webinar. Today's webinar has a lot of content. Folks who are regular watchers of these monthly webinars know that we put in this slide with all of the monthly content. Not to say that we're going to cover every single thing, but that this information is in this slide deck. So if you download it from the onevoiceinfo.com website, you will find all of this content. I'm going to start, as I believe, Omar, you will want to do, with what is going on in Congress and the year-end agenda. And so I will turn it to you to lead that discussion. And then I know we'll go through regulations and tax and tariffs and trade and a whole host of other things. So over to you, Omar.
Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, with Congress reopening the government, we do have a flurry of regulatory activity that's been pent up, and we expect to see even more when we come together on our next webinar in January after we see what the agencies do here in December. But let's start up on Capitol Hill. They are back. They are certainly in full speed, as much as the U.S. Congress can be these days. The lawmakers usually just have one job to do, especially in the House, and that's to pass 12 government spending bills, and that's what keeps the lights on at the federal agencies. This year, what led to the government shutdown, they had 0 done by October the 1st. They reopened the government with 3 out of 12 completed. That leaves the biggest ones, including the Department of Defense, Labor, and Health and Labor HHS, Health and Human Services Department also has not been completed, and that's where most of the money and most of the differences between the two parties tend to come about. So if we do not have the other 9 remaining government spending bills completed by January the 30th, then we will go have another shutdown on January the 31st for those agencies that are not currently funded. If we do not have significant, or at least some level of movement here in talks in December, that makes the few days that we've got in January for legislating very, very difficult. As of right now, the last day both the House and Senate are scheduled to be in the same place in January is January 15th. So meaning the last 15 days leading into a shutdown, either the House or Senate will not be here. That I think will change as we get there, but this is going to dominate most. Based on conversations we've had both this week on the Hill and last week at events, it's our understanding they will not vote in the House this month on any of the remaining 9 government spending bills. This week is already over. Next week is going to be dedicated to the National Defense Authorization Act, and that's likely to pass as it has every year since 1961. And that doesn't leave much time left for appropriations going into the holiday recess and holiday break. Congress is going to return around January the 6th, 7th, and that again until the 31st doesn't leave much time. Eventually, if they don't have an agreement, they might have to resort to yet again a 1-year continuing resolution extension, but I think most are trying to avoid that. On the defense side of things, they were hoping to have a bill released yesterday that would have been both a bipartisan and final package. There's a number of things that are being hung up. The White House opposing some China export control language, and then also possible right to repair, which is very significant for those of you in the defense supply chain, as it would require the primes, at least the Senate language would, to hand over their data and their technical prints and all other information to DoD, so that way the Defense Department could go further and purchase aftermarket repair parts on their own. That's largely what we're expecting Congress to tackle this month. There's going to be some Affordable Care Act votes next week, but largely the legislative lift is going to be on the defense bill, and as the behind-the-scenes work on appropriations continues in an effort to avoid a shutdown. All right, let's run through some regulations. We've got a couple of notices here, including on overtime, and the Trump account notices have just come out from the IRS just in the last week or so. A quick overview on the Trump accounts in case you end up getting employees that ask you questions about it. Note that it is a one-time $1,000 pilot program contribution for those that are born between January 1 of 2025 and December 31st of 2028. More realistically, though, the money's not going to come out. It cannot be withdrawn until January 1st of the calendar year in which they turn 18. So that's still a long ways ago off, but in case, again, HR receives questions, that's where you need to be and reference it. IRS issued not really a guidance, but I guess it is in some ways, an update on both tips and overtime, no tax on. This is the overtime example. They put 3 examples on here. One of the other employee example, she worked for a government entity. So we just put these 2 up here. And for your CPAs, a lot of the headlines have talked about $12,500 being the cap for per individual, $25,000 per married couple for those filing jointly, being the limitation on the overtime tax deduction. It also has a phase down for $150,000 for individual AGI, and then also $250 or $300 rather for those that are filing jointly. Keep in mind, in order to get that $12,500, you'd have to work quite a bit of overtime. So the more realistic examples here, they're putting in at the $5,000, which is the PHLSA overtime premium, and that's where you want to be looking at your gauge and working backwards from this. So we have some additional directive from the IRS with regards to overtime and calculations, and now the context of these examples to go along with the initial. They put out 2 guidance now. One was an overview in September, and then I believe it was last month's slide deck, or it was in October, we gave you a little bit more details. So you should have enough now to at least proceed through the rest of the calendar year on overtime. Over the Department of Labor, this is less for what shops need to be doing for themselves internally, but more if you are involved in workforce development, training, recruitment, partnerships with local education institutions. There's a significant change going on in Washington at the Department of Education. While they cannot shut down the department, as some have called for, without an act of Congress, they are moving much of their responsibilities over to the Department of Labor. And that is a significant change over here for those of us that have worked on labor and training policy for some time, in that education department would handle adults, career technical education, some youth programs as well, K through 12 coordination. But obviously, education policy is run by the states, but education department still did play a role there. So now the Labor Department is going to take on a greater role in administering these K through 12 programs that have historically been over at the Education Department. Some of the challenges and concern from some in the community are, does DOL have the expertise that others have developed over decades working over at the Labor Department? But now they're going to be point DOL is for workforce and college programs along alignment with K through 12. We're also seeing on the post-secondary education partnership side as well that Labor Department's going to manage the competitions, provide technical assistance, and integrate the Education Department's post-secondary education programs into larger programs that the Department of Labor already administers. So again, entities, school districts that might be reliant on some of these programs might see some disruptions as some of this continues to go on over there as well. This one also came out 2 days before Thanksgiving. For those that are on here that are part of either association or are involved in the foundations and other local nonprofits, the Department of Labor issued a TEGL, basically to notice that they put out within their systems, a training and employment guidance letter is what it's called, among several waivers that they're including. The next slide is more significant, but for those that did work with us on investment training accounts that came up in the context of WIOA in the last Congress, what this waiver does is it allows for the use for investment training accounts for in-school youth in addition to the out-of-school youth. So that'll free up some training funds to be able to go to these individuals and that they can go on and be able to use programs, including those that are potentially offered by NTMA and PMA as part of the training. And that's what's significant also within this waiver that was announced on November the 25th is that the Department of Labor will accept waiver applications from the states to consider requests that individual training account requirements can also be used for contract for services and not just for the already approved employer training list that's out there. So there's an EPL that's been out that each state carries for who's approved, and this now allows for foundations, for nonprofits, for trade associations that do work in the space of training and apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeship programs to contract with local workforce investment boards so they can customize programs that would be offer training services and solutions on a local level. In addition, it has some of these programs that would here feature an explicit employer validation and offer job guarantees, which is a lot of what already PMA and NTMA are doing through their foundation work. So this loosening and offering of waivers to the states and localities should help in certain instances and pockets where those are up. On the other side of the ledger, OSHA is back up and running. Also, we have heard about a surge, so to speak, across several of our associations on lockout, tagout inspections, and OSHA coming in and questioning the use of the minor servicing exemptions for routine maintenance and tool changes and requiring a full powering down under uncontrolled hazardous energy. So for those of you that are hearing of that, please reach out to us, Jenny or Christy or myself. We've been kind of trying to collect and see a better sense of where OSHA field inspectors are going on this. But as you can see, OSHA, the agency, is now actively addressing the backlog of complaints, but they have extended the time employers have to respond to citations that were issued immediately prior to that shutdown. And most notably, for those of you that are currently engaged in an OSHA inspection or dispute, please note that shutdown days do not, quote, count as working days. That's an important clarification that they put out just on the 2nd, so just on Monday this week, just a few days ago. Waters of the U.S., those of you that are in rural areas that might have a stream or a pond or a man-made cooling ditch that you might have in the back, you've been following this issue for now since the Obama era's Waters of the U.S. The Supreme Court directed the Army Corps of Engineers and also the EPA to come up with final and new definitions, and they are working through that. This is very significant what they posted also before Thanksgiving. This aligns with the Supreme Court case in the rule in the Sackett decision versus the EPA. The updated definitions that deal with a continuous surface connection, that is what is really critical, where in a lot of areas previously the EPA was trying to claim jurisdiction over an additional 8 million miles of nautical waterways inland under this proposal under the Obama era, and a lot of that was going to be done through underground. And this one also does have certain exclusions that are very critical here for certain ditches and groundwater and wastewater treatment systems. So for those of you that are affected by this, you really are affected by it. And those of you that are not, this is probably new to you. But please note, for those that are, this is a proposed rule and they're making progress ahead of some of the upcoming deadlines they have in the late winter, early spring. This received a lot of attention this week. You in the automotive community also have probably been seeing a lot of it as well. But let me just clarify, despite some of this saying that it covers MY 2022 to 26, it does not, since all of those have already been designed and are in production and sold and on the road in many cases. So we really are looking at an MY 27 or more likely a MY 28 through 31 in the new CAFE, the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards that they are putting out and revising. They are now calling for a fleet-wide industry fleet-wide average for each OEM. That's for all light-duty vehicles of what accounts for 34.5 miles per gallon, and that's down from the Biden rule of 50 mpg. So that is very significant there as well. Just a quick summary of where you're going. It's going to take it from 50 down to 34.5 on the mpg, and that's by model year 2031. Very significant for the OEMs, especially for those that have been building up credits early in the year and selling them and trading them off. They're going to get rid of the trading system for those credits between the OEMs. So that's significant, in addition to the reclassification of fleet categories that are going to be, instead of passenger versus light truck, they're going to be looking at it now versus passenger versus non-passenger in some of these fleet classifications there as well. So that's something to watch closely. And then also on the proposed side, this is going to get tied up in the courts for a bit. But particulate matter 2.5, this comes in at 1/13th the size of a human hair, and these are the ones that come from soot. A lot of facilities will put out a PM 2.5 is the emission. It's one of the 6 pollutants that are regulated under the Clean Air Act. And this is being, the EPA is looking to scrap the PM 2.5 standard that has been put out, and they filed this in a court motion to do so. Again, this is going in, they're asking it to vacate the tighter standards that were put forward by the Biden administration. What happens when you're in a non-attainment zone in PM 2.5? States have to come up with an attainment plan that is then approved by the EPA for all of their counties that are considered in violation of this, the GHG or PM10 and some of the others as well. And that could potentially restrict economic activities in those areas that are deemed non-attainment, so that kind of bring their areas under control. So this would roll back and restore the previous limit that was under the previous Trump term that's on there as well. Won't spend too much time on this. This is for you all that have to deal with PFAS reporting. There should not be that many, especially now with the change that deals with the 0.1% on the de minimis and on the manufacturing and remove some of the importing requirements. We were on an hour and a half meeting yesterday with the Small Business Office of Advocacy, talking to the folks over at EPA on this, on what's going on with forever chemicals on PFAS and some of the reporting requirements. What's important for you all to know, if you are required to report, they did not delay any further than they already did a few months ago. Those reporting requirements, these more address some of the 0.1% and getting onto the de minimis side of it as well. Addresses only 5 companies that are out there that are on, see Cleveland Cliffs, U.S. Steel, then a small 3 others, or some small other 3 other companies that manufacture steel. They're providing an executive order that's going to provide a little bit of an exemption for compliance rules temporarily for 2 years with some of the coke producers out there that the steel industry relies upon. This one's significant for your terminologies and for your safety manuals, and won't get too much into this. Some of you are a lot more, have your expertise on your ANSI and on your ISO. They are updating terminology for cobots, and they're trying to move away from that definition for the cooperative robot, in large part because it's for safety reasons and the interaction of a human with a non-human machine. So for the safety purposes and for the standard setting, please note that both ISO and ANSI are now using different terminology. Rather than treating a cooperative robot as a robot type, the new standard focuses on the application, allowing for a nuanced safety controls and human robot interaction environments. So just note that they're watching that one there as well. Sticking with the metal side, the government issued an infrastructure report on how to deal with sustaining metals manufacturing. So it should be very important to all of you also. The government's looking there as well. And just quickly, a couple others here to round out our regulatory slides here for those that deal with Pentagon, Department of Defense, Department of War issues that are out there. The Pentagon has updated their acquisition strategy. We've known this has been coming for some time, and now in November, they did update this as well. They're looking here at streamlining a lot of their supply chain, and is particularly their contracting, and looking at multi-year contracting and establishing not just incentives for suppliers, but more stable demand. So that way the defense industrial base can build out appropriately ahead of time and not just react to the latest PO or like a low IDIQ kind of issue that's out there. So with that, just wanted to flag a few of those regulatory items, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Jennifer Reed to run through a lot of trade issues that we've got going on, starting with USMCA.
Thanks, Omar. There are a lot of trade slides. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, but you'll all get the data that's in them when you get a copy of the recording and the slides. So we are wrapping up here this week in Washington, where it snowed today for the first time. 3 days of hearings on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement renewal. This is the mandated public comment period and public meetings that the USTR has to have. The automotive folks had their very own afternoon yesterday to talk about the automotive supply chain and the importance of its renewal, with some caveats. So we'll have a report on that, I'm sure, soon. But bottom line is there were 3 days instead of 1 day because there were so many people that wanted to testify. Next slide. So just a quick wrap up. I won't go over everything on these slides, but here's where we stand with China as of November, right? So a deal was struck between the US and China, which is essentially a 1-year deal, and it lowered the fentanyl tariff rate to 10% from 20. It agreed to keep the reciprocal IEEPA tariff rate at 10%. So that still leaves some other tariffs in place, and you roughly get a 45% total tariff for China. So it's 10 plus 10 plus 25 for most people who are on list 3. If you are steel and aluminum, obviously, you still have a 50% you have to add in there. So I think the most important part about the agreement was that it is actually in writing, right? He issued an order, the president issued an order, which has the 1-year agreement deal in it. Each side had to agree to undo some threats, which both sides have done, pretty much completed as of this week. So I think it does give us a little bit more certainty that we're good to go on these numbers for China for a while. The president last week or during the Thanksgiving break spoke with the president of China, and apparently the plan is for Trump to visit China in April. Next slide. One of the things the U.S. agreed to do on its side in order to be part of that deal was to extend a group of exclusions from the 2018 301 list. Those have that Federal Register notice published this week. The link is on the slide. Here's a quick list. If you've had one of these exclusions and you were waiting for it to be extended, that you know about it already, and you were very happy to see that printed this week. Next slide. Switzerland. Switzerland is one of those countries where we have a framework, but we do not actually have new HTS codes or a new customs guidance. So people are expecting it. I'll put in quotations any day now. Omar has here in early 2026. I think that's probably right. I don't think we see it in the next couple of weeks, but I do think we see it early on. So as with most deals that have been negotiated, it takes the rate. In the case of Switzerland, it was 39% for most goods, down to 15. 15 seems to be the magic number. But remember that except for in very, very special cases like South Korea and Japan, the 232 orders on steel and aluminum, autos, etc., do not change. South Korea and Japan have an agreement on autos. Here it is on this slide. They do get the 15% on auto and auto parts that are subject to the Section 232s. Because I also represent the fastener industry, I'll take a moment to remind those of you that may make things in the Chapter 73 world like fasteners. And remember that while many, many fasteners go into the automotive world, we are not considered an auto part on the Section 232 auto part list. You are considered a steel and aluminum derivative. And that order, the steel and aluminum order, is not included in any of these agreements, in spite of other countries wishing that it was.
Let's stop there for a second because you
Sure.
brought up a really important point that within the trade community, we have a lot of companies that are trying to get themselves onto an auto list in order to benefit from a 15% rate or a 25% instead of the 50 if you are classified as a steel derivative. And so that's a parlor game that's starting to go on here in
That
Washington.
is a great point, Omar. And I will once again point out that the president's executive order on Section 232 trucks, which came out a couple of weeks ago, included language that allowed companies to self-determine if you are selling a part that should be an auto part, but it wasn't listed on the original auto part list. However, this is a really big however. You cannot do that if your part is in Chapter 72, 73, or 76. So a fastener, for example, cannot be determined to be an auto part for purposes of these tariff actions, even though the fastener is going into the car, which means you also can't participate in your OEM's supplier offset program. Next slide. This is still on South Korea. The guidance came out this week. If any of you need to know, Customs listed all of the instructions for how to apply that 15% rate on South Korea. Okay, so we did get a US-UK pharma pricing deal announced, which the next slide will point out includes some medical technology. I think we just got the press release. We don't yet have the HTS numbers in case some of you make medical equipment. But I think this announcement, as well as I believe the next slide or one very soon, talks about the announcement about reciprocal tariffs being adjusted again in the last few weeks. It continues to be a little bit of a peek behind the curtain in the administration's thinking of that there are some things that they are willing to negotiate on. And I'll get to that in a second. Next slide. So here, right before Thanksgiving, we had 4 more countries who agreed to deals, 2 of which are an actual agreement, 2 of which are a framework. All the links are here for you to look at them. And again, 15% is the magic number. Here's the exemption executive order I was referencing. So while none of us live in the world of agricultural goods like coffee and bananas, I do think it's important to note that this action, which in essence exempted an enormous list of products or added to the exemption list, which we call Annex 2 in Washington, continues to give the rest of us who make products in other categories besides agriculture some small sliver of hope that for those things that are not made in the United States, we're going to talk a minute about, I think, somewhere the ongoing threat of Section 232s on industrial machinery, for example, that there is some willingness to find a way to exclude them for at least some period of time if they are truly not made in the United States. So that's what this order gave me some hope about. India's still working on a deal, as I understand it. We have a delegation going to India next week. These are some announcements on some of the things that they are willing to do. I will tell you, in the fastener world, we still have some concerns with India trade. Not some, we have a lot. This continues to make us a little nervous in hopes that we don't continue to have a unfair advantage in India.
Yeah, we agree with you. We were at a meeting with USTR week before last, and in the meeting with that staffer, we told her very clearly the challenge that increasingly the industry sees with India, despite all the attention that China receives. And reason putting this slide in here is to show you that the subsidies that the Indian government and state governments give, whether it's electricity or subsidizing the metals for their industry over there, are certainly looking to continue. And now they're doing even more for exporters, which means that India and the challenge from there is just going to continue to grow.
Right, exactly. The U.S. updated its one of its critical minerals list. We actually keep two in the United States. But the Department of Interior has one through the Geological Survey, and they released its final updated list. And some important things were added. They have asterisks here on this chart, copper being one of them. I see this as the precursor to the announcement of a critical minerals Section 232 order, because now once you are on this list, you're considered critical to national security. So that gives the United States, that gives the USTR the ability to say, here, these are the chemicals or these are the critical minerals we're including in the Section 232. But again, we're going to find ourselves in a situation where some of these are just not made in the United States. Many of these critical minerals go into stainless steel, for an example. And so it's going to be one of those times when, while the steel industry likes to argue for tariffs, they don't like tariffs on their own inputs. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch. Canada. Canada announced updates to its retaliation. I'm going to put it in the retaliation bucket. They would tell you that this is not retaliation, right? That this is an effort to protect their Canadian steel industry. And it is. It's absolutely that. But it's also tied up in a retaliation bucket. So they've had quotas for since the beginning of the year, really since March. They are lowering those quotas for raw material. They're listed here on the slides. And once the quota, this is the same way quotas work here in the United States. Once the quotas hit, then they're subject to a 50% tariff. You'll see different rates if you're a free trade agreement country like the United States than it is if you're China. Next slide, though. They also announced a 25% tariff on steel derivatives. They're listed here. I will note that although they specifically called out fasteners have had a 25% retaliatory tariff since March in Canada. This is not additive, so it's not going to be 50%. I think they just added fasteners to the list to remind us all they were included. So some of these things have had a 25% tariff. And I don't want people to think that it means that it's 50. The best I can tell, it is still just 25 on these steel derivatives.
But I think it shows you where, to your point earlier, where the Canadians really are. Starting this summer, when they started announcing that they were going to reduce some of the quota allowances coming in, and then also some of the efforts to really get to the point of what U.S. has been complaining about, China using Canada as a backdoor. They're using Chinese steel to manufacture and fabricate parts that are then coming into the U.S. without a tariff on it. So you're starting to see just the ripple effects of U.S. impact. And this, as far as our read, does not exclude items that are USMCA compliant. So meaning even goods that are on this list that do comply with the USMCA that are being shipped from the US up into Canada, they are subject to that 25% tariff. Again, in some cases going back to the spring, but certainly now moving forward. And is this a precursor of more to come, in particular with discussions between the US and Canada being non-existent as of right now? With regards to the USMCA talks that are really going to kick off, hopefully after the first of the year, with the report from USTR to up to Capitol Hill. So we'll be
Yeah.
watching this space closely.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would also point out that the reason why they're not, that the USMCA compliance doesn't fall into place here is because the US did the same thing, right? So under Section 232 steel and aluminum, we don't let compliant USMCA compliance matter under the Section 232 order the way we do under IEEPA. So there's a real issue here because, as many of you know, there is Canadian raw material steel that we need in the United States. We don't make enough of for in the fastener world. We don't make enough CHQ wire rod, for example, in the US. We have to import it from Canada. So there's just like with automotive, as we talk about the connectivity of North American supply chains, it's very true in metal parts too. So,
Yeah.
next slide.
So speaking of metals,
Yeah,
Paul, we'll turn
I
it
think
over
that's
to
it.
you.
Great.
So this week we saw the appointment of two officials onto U.S. Steel's board. As you may recall, back when the U.S. reached a deal and U.S. Steel agreed to have two U.S. government officials on their board, and they are two officials from the Commerce Department. One is William Kimmett, and he is viewed as more of he's a trade hawk. Both of them are currently at the Department of Commerce. The other one is David Shapiro. Shapiro is looked at as he's currently chief counsel for the Commerce Department Investment Accelerator, so where he handles legal and compliance issues. So his background is mostly government legal work, and his position on the board is meant to ensure that U.S. Steel meets its commitments that it made to the federal government as part of its new ownership structure. Just you may recall William Kimmett. He's the Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, and his role is to also, obviously monitor U.S. Steel's compliance. I mean, it's a very unique situation. So we'll just have to see the role that they play on the board, particularly when it comes to decisions when there's plant closures and things like that. If you go to the next slide, you can see that this is the steel benchmarker report, and this is regarding U.S. hot rolled steel prices versus the rest of the world. It's been pretty consistent the last few reports, but still as usual, a significant gap. And diving into these numbers a little bit and I'm just talking about hot roll steel because we kind of use that as the hot roll steel price in the U.S. is at $912, compared to the EU is at $710 and China's at $395. The interesting thing I think this week is that we also track the utilization capacity of the domestic steel industry, the U.S. steel industry. This was one of the original reasons back in the first Trump administration, and one of the factors that the Commerce Department recommended these 232 tariffs back in 2018, that they wanted to get the capacity utilization rate at 80%. It's at 72%, and just looking historically, that's down from 76.7% back in the beginning of November. Now that could be scheduled shutdowns. I was looking at last year's number, which was down to about 72 back in October of 2024. But we always like to keep a look at that. It's been hovering between 76. It's been about 76, between 76 and 79 for since September 2024. But given all the announcements and focus on increasing steel production in the United States, we'll keep a close look at that number.
Thanks, Paul. A few things just want to flag as our usual charts. We're going to wrap up here in 2 minutes, so please feel free to type in any questions into the Q&A box, and we're happy to get to those. We've got 3 questions already lined up that we're going to try to address. OECD numbers that came out here. One number that we didn't have because it just came out this morning on India. Their actual GDP is expected to be, or is 8.2%, and they grew at their fastest pace in the July through October quarter in recent history. So that's pretty significant there as well. We did see on our side of manufacturing ISM PMI still hovering below 50. That obviously means contraction. And then when we look at it on the Chinese side, we are seeing some slowdown on the Chinese as well, although they did have a little bump on the export as well. On the Japan side, that's also starting to see where factory output. Now you can see the US, Japan, and Germany coming together. The German numbers have started to actually jump up a little bit, just even in the last couple of weeks. So we've started to see new numbers come there, but gives you an idea that Japan is starting to go up a little bit, and the US still seems a little bit more on the soft side there as well. The trade gap with Mexico continues to widen. This is part of the conversations we're having with the US government, in particularly about the Chinese investment. You can almost see a direct correlation between the amount of shipments from China coming into the US dropping and those from Mexico increasing. And that's a large part because of China's transshipping, and then also China is investing in Mexico and then bringing those parts up into the US. We're starting to get some more of our job numbers to trickle out. We should have some more even data this morning. We're starting to get some of the other issues related to unemployment insurance data started to come out yesterday. So this is just the latest, at least from ADP, that was able to put together until the government comes back up and running. As always, you can stay connected with us. Our One Voice podcast, we're going to be recording another one early next week, so that should post by mid next week as well. Always be able to find that on any one of your platforms. We encourage all of you to continue supporting the advocacy program that makes this webinar and all our other activities in Washington possible by clicking on these links to donate there as well. And as always, happy to take any questions that you might have. We've got a couple of them here that came in, and Jennifer, if you unmute, feel free to jump in on any of these. Let me start with the non-trade one first and then jump into the 2 trade questions afterwards. This comes with regards to manufacturing extension partnership programs. MEPs are a network of different consultants and organizations spread out across the country. They are private organizations that are funded in part by the federal government, in part by states, and in part by you all that use their services. Everything from consultings on business accounting, administration, ERP, training, you name it, they do it. They focus on small businesses. And again, they're located throughout the country. You'll know them as Magnet, MMTC, Champ, some of the other names that are out there, NJMEPs, a few others that are out. The question came in. Commerce is eliminating funding for all Commerce is eliminating funding for all MEPs. Prior users of these services, many of us, will need to look for state and private providers. This is a statement. I'll turn it into a question. The question then would be, what is happening and what are we doing? We actually had a meeting on this on Wednesday morning on MEPs. This is part of the Commerce Department, correct? And we saw somebody with the National Institute of Standards and Technology earlier in the week and brought this up as well. Yes, they are not renewing contracts for the MEPs, and that started happening in April, then again on July 1st with another tranche, and then it's going to continue with California being, I think, up at the end of this year, or it already was not renewed. So that's significant. The other side of it is this has happened before. W. Bush tried to zero out the MEPs. Congress brought them back. There is current $150 million, I think, is in the Senate CJS bill that deals with the Commerce Department. So as of right now, Congress is looking to put the money back, but then they're going to have to fight with the government about actually spending it. So yes, the MEPs are very much on our radar screen and in Capitol Hill, and that is something that you need the appropriators to pass that government spending bill in order to try to force the administration to renew the contracts and to spend the money that's going to be allocated. So that's the latest on MEPs that we're hearing. Two-part question here, and then do want to give a little color to what we're hearing on the robotics. After a meeting we had earlier this week with some government folks. Question two-parter. Are Chinese and Korean-owned plants in Mexico subject to tariffs if and when they import steel coil or tube from their respective countries? Is that determined unilaterally, or is it determined by U.S.-Mexico trade agreement and or USMCA? The Chinese and Korean-owned plants in Mexico, if they're bringing in imported steel and coil, that's going to be determined by the government of Mexico. The Mexican government in July did increase a number of tariffs and then add a number of other products to those tariff lines that would be subject to there. And then before I turn it over to Jennifer, this is kind of the back end of that question and where this comes in here. What country of origin would assembly fabricated in Mexico but uses imported raw material from Asia be classified under? And that goes to the issue we've been bringing up with USTR about China setting up shop in Mexico, because when they're making parts in Mexico, they are USMCA compliant for purposes of duties. However, the steel issue, if they are made out of steel and they're on the derivative list or aluminum, then the origin of that metal does matter. And it already mattered if it was an automotive part for USMCA regional value content. But it certainly is going to be an issue increasingly as we see South Korea and China setting up shop down in Mexico. But in the case of it's made down there, it's made down there. But Jennifer, love to have your input too.
No, I think you summarized it well. We do have examples of OEMs who stopped buying a part in the United States that they had shipped into a Mexican plant for assembly and started buying it in China and having that part come from China to Mexico. So they avoided a 25% tariff from 301, and then reassembled and set back under the USMCA. So we have had US auto suppliers with that scenario, and that's a problem because, as Omar said, our trade laws in the United States have for decades been based on where a part was manufactured and or assembled, right? It falls under that phrase substantial transformation. This administration, I think, as part of the USMCA negotiations, is certainly going to try to get at that country of origin issue, whether they call it a transshipment issue, whether they call it a melt and pour requirement, an increased rule of origin, regional content value. An example, many of your parts are not considered in the USMCA regional value content calculations by OEMs, right? Because you don't, if you're not making a transmission or an engine, but you're making a small part that goes into that, you might not get that benefit. So I think that does become all part of the USMCA discussion.
Agreed. Thank you. One final point to bring up on robotics, since you mentioned it as well, based on meetings that we had last week, as well as this week with government folks, our understanding is, quote, that this 232 investigation report is still several months away. And what that means for normal people is the Department of Commerce on September 2nd initiated an investigation into potential tariffs on industrial machinery and robotics. September 2nd is a date that triggers 270 days for Commerce to complete a report that will then be sent to the White House for review. That also has its own timeline of, I think, 90 days to review it. No one thinks 270 is going to be needed, but they are saying they're still several months away, and they're looking at not just tariffs, but potentially some other action items to try to address how to bring more industrial machinery manufacturing to the United States within that 232 report. We'd also heard that until the Supreme Court rules on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act decision, that we probably are not going to see new 232 cases announced by this administration. They're waiting to see what happens with the Supreme Court decision that many expect at the end of this month or early next before deciding what they'll do next, as especially because they plan on using these 232s to make up for any loss that they have on the IEEPA side. With that, happy to answer any other questions. I know we've run a little bit long, but as always, quite a bit going on even in December. Okay. Seeing none, come on. Thank you all for joining us on a Friday. Our next one announcements will go out will be on Friday. I believe it's January the 9th at noon Eastern. We'll talk to you all then. Thank you all and enjoy the rest of your week.